The silent fear you trigger in married men, they'll never admit this. Carl Jung, have you ever noticed how certain married men suddenly become cold, distant, or even hostile around you without any logical reason? Picture this. A colleague who used to be friendly now avoids eye contact. A married friend who suddenly stops responding to messages. A neighbor who seems uncomfortable whenever you're near. What's happening beneath the surface? According to depth psychology, you might be triggering something these men will never consciously acknowledge. A fear so profound that it shakes the very foundation of their carefully constructed identity. This isn't about attraction or infidelity. It's something far more unsettling. You're awakening parts of themselves they've spent years suppressing. You represent a psychological threat they can't name, can't explain, and certainly can't admit, even to themselves. What is this silent fear? And why does your mere presence cause such internal chaos? The answer lies in the hidden chambers of the masculine psyche, where truths were discovered that most men would rather die than face. 1. The mirror effect. Why your presence exposes his hidden self. There's something disturbing about how certain people function as psychological mirrors. Every interaction reflects aspects of ourselves we prefer to ignore. For married men who have built a rigid identity based on responsibility, predictability, and control, you might be the most threatening mirror that exists, not because you do anything wrong, but simply because you exist authentically. When he looks at you, even without realizing it, he's seeing fragments of himself that he had to suppress to fit into the role of ideal husband. Maybe it's your spontaneity, your way of expressing opinions without filters, or simply how you live without asking permission. This creates a silent confrontation within him. His conscious mind says he's happy, satisfied, fulfilled. But the presence of someone living with more inner freedom awakens uncomfortable questions. Did I really choose this life, or just accept what was expected of me? The unconscious begins screaming truths that consciousness doesn't want to hear. And here's the problem. The more he represses these questions, the more uncomfortable your presence becomes. He can't name what he feels. He just knows he needs to distance himself from you. The most primitive defense mechanism kicks in: avoidance. If he doesn't see you, he doesn't have to face what you represent. If he doesn't interact, he can keep pretending those parts of him don't exist. That's why hostility appears out of nowhere. It's not about you. It's about the unbearable reflection you create. Every casual conversation, every genuine laugh of yours, every moment you're simply yourself without masks, becomes a painful reminder of everything he abandoned. His authenticity was traded for social approval. His vitality was negotiated for security. And now you appear, living exactly what he sacrificed, without even noticing the internal chaos you're causing. 2. The imprisoned shadow, what he buried to become husband material. Every man carries within himself a version that never came to light. We're not talking about superficial fantasies, but genuine aspects of personality that were deliberately buried. To become what society, family, and even himself defined as the ideal husband, he had to kill essential parts of who he really was. That guy who loved adventures? Dead. The dreamer who wanted to drop everything and travel? Buried. The rebel who questioned conventions? Silenced. This process of psychological self-mutilation happens gradually, almost without noticing. First comes external pressure. Be responsible, mature, build something solid. Then comes internal pressure. Prove you're reliable, stable, predictable. And in the middle of this process, he keeps cutting pieces of himself as if they were dead branches from a tree. But here's the brutal truth. These pieces don't die. They stay alive in the basement of the psyche, knocking on the door, demanding recognition. When you appear embodying precisely these qualities he buried, something inside him panics. You're not doing anything wrong. You're just being spontaneous where he learned to be calculated. You're being free where he chose to be contained. You're living with passion where he opted for security. And this hurts in a way he can't explain even to himself. The anger he feels isn't really directed at you. It's directed at himself, at the internal coward who gave up on his own dreams. Every time he sees you living authentically, it's like watching a movie of the life he could have had, the life he chose not to live. And that comparison is devastating, because unlike external comparisons where he can blame circumstances, bad luck, lack of opportunities, this comparison is internal. It's between who he is and who he could have been if he'd had courage. And courage, unlike talent or resources, is something he knows he had and chose not to use. That's why your presence is so unbearable. You're not just living differently, you're living the difference he was too afraid to choose. If you want to understand why you trigger a silent fear in married men that they'll never admit, and how this fear reveals the hidden shadow they can't confront, the Jung method is fixed in the first comment. 3. The anima projection. When you embody his forbidden dream. Inside every man exists an unconscious image of the ideal feminine. It's not about physical beauty or external attributes, but about emotional, spiritual, and psychological qualities he unconsciously seeks. This image is built from childhood, shaped by experiences, frustrations, and unfulfilled desires. For many married men, this image remains dormant, buried under layers of pragmatism and commitment, until someone like you appears. Suddenly, without warning, you embody aspects of that internal image he didn't even know existed. It might be your emotional independence, your intellectual depth, your way of facing life with both lightness and seriousness. It's not about conscious seduction. It's about psychological resonance. He looks at you and sees projected on the outside something that always lived inside him but never found in reality. And this creates absolute chaos, because now he needs to deal with an impossible truth. He married the wrong person. Or worse, he married for the wrong reasons. Maybe he chose stability instead of deep connection, security instead of genuine passion, family approval instead of real compatibility. And you, without doing absolutely anything, are exposing this cruel truth. Every interaction becomes a painful reminder that there's something deeper, truer, more aligned with who he really is. But he can't have that. He's already made his choices, already built his life, already assumed commitments he can't simply undo. So only one option remains: turn you into an enemy, demonize your presence, create physical and emotional distance, because facing the truth would be too devastating. The really tragic part is that this has nothing to do with who you actually are. You're just a blank screen where he projects everything he never allowed himself to want, everything he convinced himself wasn't important, everything he sacrificed at the altar of practicality. And now that projection walks, talks, breathes in front of him, and he can't have it, can't touch it, can't even admit he wants it. So all that remains is to destroy the screen, make you disappear from his field of vision. Because as long as you exist nearby, he'll never have peace with his choices. 4. The stability illusion. Why your freedom threatens his security. His life was built brick by brick on top of a promise: if I do everything right, I'll have security. Marriage, house, stable career, predictable routine. Every decision was made thinking about minimizing risks, controlling variables, guaranteeing results. And for years this worked, or at least seemed to work. Until you appeared living in a completely different way. You don't follow the manual, don't seem obsessed with guarantees, make decisions based on something deeper than pure logic. And yet, you seem fine, you seem whole, you seem alive in a way he hasn't felt in years. This shakes everything, because if you can live without all these ties he believed were necessary, then maybe he sacrificed his freedom for nothing. Maybe all that security he pursued is just an illusion. A golden prison he built himself. The truth is, many men trade life for survival, trade authenticity for predictability, and convince themselves this is maturity, wisdom, responsibility. But deep down, they know it's fear. Fear of risking, failing, disappointing, being judged. So they build fortresses around themselves and call it home. And you, with your fluid way of existing, are showing there are other possibilities. That life doesn't need to be so rigid, so controlled, so suffocating. He can't accept this, because accepting would mean admitting he wasted years living with fear disguised as prudence. Would mean facing there's still time to change. But change would require courage he's not sure he possesses. So it's easier to blame you, label you as irresponsible, immature, lost, all to avoid having to face his own cowardly choices. The really perverse part is that he'll recruit others to validate his narrative. He'll talk about you as if you were the problem, as if your way of living was somehow wrong, risky, unsustainable. He needs others to agree with him, because alone he can't sustain the lie. He needs a chorus of voices saying he made the right choice. That freedom is overrated. That security is what really matters, because if everyone agrees, then maybe it's true. Maybe he really didn't waste his life building a beautiful cage. 5. The authenticity wound. How you remind him of his abandoned self. There's a moment in many men's lives when they stop being who they are and start being who they should be. It happens so gradually they don't even notice. One day they're full of dreams, passions, crazy ideas. The next day, they're calculating mortgages, planning retirements, living for weekends. Authenticity was negotiated, traded for acceptance, approval, security. And for years this seems to work, until someone like you crosses his path. You're not trying to prove anything. You're not performing for any audience. You simply exist aligned with your internal truth. And that, this seemingly simple thing, is absolutely devastating for him. Because looking at you is like looking at a ghost. The ghost of who he could have been if he'd had courage, if he hadn't given in to pressures, if he hadn't betrayed himself in the name of normalcy. Every conversation with you is a painful reminder that there's another way to live, a more honest, more integrated, more alive way. And he doesn't know how to deal with this. He didn't learn. He spent so much time molding himself to external expectations that he lost complete contact with internal desires. Now he's trapped between two worlds, the safe world he built and the authentic world he abandoned. And you're there, freely transitioning in that second world, while he watches from afar, locked inside his own fortress. The pain of this is unbearable. It's not simple envy, it's grief. Grief for a version of himself he killed to survive socially. And since he can't resurrect that dead self without destroying the entire life he built, only one option remains: push you away. Diminish you, transform you into something threatening that justifies the distance, because facing you with honesty would be facing his own internal betrayal, and he's simply not ready for that. What makes this even more tragic is that he'll never tell you any of this. He'll never sit down and explain that your authenticity reminds him of everything he gave up, that your presence is a constant mirror of his own cowardice. Instead, he'll just be cold, distant, maybe even cruel, and you'll be left wondering what you did wrong, when the truth is you did everything right. You just had the audacity to remain yourself. 6. The comparison trap. When you reflect everything he isn't, nobody likes to feel insufficient. And for many married men, you inadvertently become the measuring standard that exposes all their inadequacies. Not because you're perfect, but because you represent qualities he didn't develop. Maybe it's your emotional intelligence, your ability to talk about deep topics without discomfort, your way of dealing with conflicts without running away, your presence that doesn't need to dominate the environment to feel valid. Each of these qualities works as a mirror reflecting what he isn't. And this creates a deep narcissistic wound, because men are conditioned from early on to be the best, the strongest, the most capable. When someone appears being clearly superior in areas he can't even name, the ego collapses. But here's the cruel detail: you're not competing. You're not trying to be better than anyone. You're just being yourself. And that's exactly what makes everything worse. If you were trying hard, he could rationalize, could think you're compensating for something, exaggerating, performing. But no, you're just like this, naturally. And this makes him question everything about himself. Why can't he have deep conversations with his own wife? Why does he avoid emotions as if they were contagious diseases? Why does his life seem so superficial compared to the internal richness he perceives in you? These questions are terrifying, because the answers would require radical changes he's not willing to make. It would take vulnerability, internal work, courage to face ugly parts of himself. It's infinitely easier to turn you into the problem, label you as complicated, difficult, too intense, all to avoid having to admit his own emotional mediocrity, his own existential superficiality, his own lack of courage to be something beyond basic functional. The really sad part is, he probably knows on some level that you're not the problem, that you're actually showing him what's possible when someone has courage to be real. But admitting that would require action, would require change, would require courage he's convinced himself he doesn't have. So instead, he builds elaborate narratives about why you're actually the broken one, why your way of being is actually problematic, why he's actually better off with his safe, predictable, emotionally shallow existence. And maybe, if he tells himself this enough times, he'll actually believe it. 7. The control panic. Why your independence triggers his powerlessness. Many men build their identity around the ability to control the environment, provide, protect, solve, lead. These roles give a sense of purpose, power, relevance, but you don't fit into this scheme. You don't need to be saved. You're not seeking masculine approval to validate your choices. You're not waiting for someone to complete your life. And this creates an existential panic in him, because if you don't need what he has to offer, then what's his value? The question seems absurd, but it lives in the unconscious of many men. They learn to feel important through others' dependence. The more someone needs them, the more significant they feel. Your independence completely breaks this pattern. You exist self-sufficiently, making decisions without asking permission, navigating life without needing rescue. And this, which should be admirable, becomes threatening, because it exposes something he never wanted to face. Relationships based on need aren't real relationships. They're transactions. He provides security, she offers validation, he solves problems, she confirms his masculinity. But when someone doesn't enter this game, the whole system collapses. And worse, your independence also makes him question his own relationship. Did his wife really choose him, or just needed someone to take on responsibilities? Is there real love, or just mutual convenience? These questions are terrifying, because the answers could destroy the narrative he built about his own life. So again, it's easier to demonize you. Call your independence coldness, your self-sufficiency arrogance, your strength masculinization, all to avoid having to admit he feels powerless before someone who doesn't need the type of power he learned to exercise. The deeply ironic part is that real power has nothing to do with control. Real power is internal. It's the ability to be complete regardless of external circumstances, to not need validation, approval, or dependence from others to feel worthy. But he never learned this. He learned the primitive version of power, domination, control, being needed, and you're showing him there's another level he never reached. a level where you don't need power over others because you have power within yourself. And that's absolutely terrifying for someone whose entire identity is built on being necessary. 8. The integration fear. What happens if he really faces this truth? The scariest truth of all isn't what you represent. It's what would happen if he actually stopped and faced all of this. If he allowed all these reflections, all these questions, all this restlessness to rise to the surface of consciousness. The result would be devastating. He'd have to admit he built a life based on fear, not love, that he chose security instead of truth, that he betrayed himself repeatedly in the name of normalcy. And after this admission, what to do? You can't simply undo decades of choices. You can't wake up one day and start over as if nothing happened. There are commitments, responsibilities, other people involved. The mess would be monumental, so the mind does what it knows how to do best. It represses, buries deeper, builds higher walls, and you involuntarily become the symbol of everything that needs to be kept outside these walls. Because if he allows you in, even just in his mental space, everything starts to crumble. Integration of these truths would require a complete reconstruction of identity, would mean facing that he's been a stranger to himself, that he lived on autopilot, following scripts he never questioned, that there's an authentic self waiting to emerge, but emerging now would cost everything he knows. Few men have courage for this journey. Most prefer to keep sleeping. Keep living the small, safe life. Keep avoiding people like you who function as psychological alarm clocks. And when you fully understand this, when you realize his hostility has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the internal demons he doesn't want to face, something interesting happens. You stop taking it personally. Stop trying to understand or fix. You simply go your way, knowing some people need their prisons, and that trying to free them by force is as cruel as imprisoning them. His work is his. Your only responsibility is to keep being authentic, free, true, even if that makes people uncomfortable, especially because it makes them uncomfortable. Because deep down, you're not here to be comfortable. You're here to be real. And that inevitably will always awaken fear in those who chose illusion.